Hey, how's it going, guys? Exploring Bones here again with another episode of Faith Reimagined, retelling biblical stories from an African perspective. Just to debrief, last time we spoke about decolonizing or decolonization as a concept and why the church should embrace it and how we can actually benefit as an African church. This time, continuing with the similar theme of decolonization, we want to talk about decolonization of theology and seminary, and then also talk about why is that important for the African church or even the African individuals who bear the name of God to really take in this narrative as we build forward or building a theology around it. So, what is it about theology that is colonized? And why is it problematic for the African church?
Yeah, I think it's important first, I think, to obviously define the concept theology.
Yeah.
And I think when I think about theology, I think about two things. One, obviously the study of God, the study of the person of God and his character. So theology primarily, or the content of theology, is God and his work and his character, all that involves him. And then two, I think, theology is this conversation between the scriptures and the context. So theology is always done, within a social location. And so in theology, fundamentally, right, seeks to answer questions like, what does it mean to love God or follow God within this social location? What it means to live out my faith, in this context. And so you see these two things with theology, right? God as the subject of the content, and then two, the interaction of, the understanding of who God is and the context of the social location that the people that are studying that God, exist in. So I think what has happened though is that there's been, a certain social location or context, people from a certain context that have said, our context is the right one. We have monopoly on actually dictating, from the scriptures, what is true and what is right, and this is the only way that we need to understand. We need to understand God, and I think that's where the colonization part comes in. I mean, historically, we see, with colonization, ethnic group coming to certain nations, extending their control and saying our narrative, our context will dominate you guys. And so I think theologically as well, there's that aspect where, unfortunately, the Western context really has said, our understanding of God is the right one, and everyone, should look at the Bible and look at God from our perspective, from our worldviews and experiences. And I think for us, we do agree that is theological colonization.
Definitely. I think it's interesting building on to what you just said about colonization of theology, that the theology that is based in our seminaries, and I mean, seminary is, for those who don't know, sort of like a school or university college where you study about God and the Bible. That on its own, the worldview that operates often in the seminaries that we have, particularly in South Africa and even in Southern Africa, which was affected by the third wave of missionaries coming from the West, is heavily influenced by that worldview. So when we talk about the people that are important in history, we look at where the Protestant Reformation. And I mean, the information, the things that they did were good for the church, but what we're failing to realize is actually the way we are approaching or the foundation that we're building our faith as Africans is based on an European worldview. And that becomes very problematic because then you become this person who you're supposed to be authentically African, where God has placed you and celebrate that. But because the worldview that you have is not from that context, that means you'll be very dysfunctional in your identity and even being faithful in your context, like what you spoke about with regards to context. So in seminary, you do see from a scholarship point, from a representation point, you see a lot of European characters, or you see a lot of even the African theologians, the early church fathers, were having white faces. Now that's become very problematic if we have to teach our South African key is to say, this is your guardians of all nations, if all the representation that comes from looks from one race. And I think that becomes problematic from a theological standpoint, because then it reinforces the idea that this way, or this theology, or this thinking of God only is correct if it comes from people who look like that.
Yeah.
And we know that that's not the God that we worship. And what we also know is that Africa is very rich in this narrative of Christianity. We had this thing, I mean, as early as 1st century all the way to 5th, 7th century. So I think from a seminary point, we have to recognize that there's something wrong with the way we're building on. It doesn't make sense that by the time I get to third year, I haven't learned anything about African Christian history. I think it's problematic because from a representation standpoint, as an African, I'm asking myself, where are my people? Has God been working through the African people? And I think then that leads us to the next point of, why should we decolonize both theology and also retell these biblical stories from an African perspective? So what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's good. And I think part of it's the process of decolonizing theology. I think for me, firstly, I think we need to acknowledge that all of us, exist within the context. All of us are bound by a certain social location, and that location has given us, certain socializations, worldviews, frameworks, and experiences. And there's almost a sense of there's nothing wrong with that. So it's like it's a God given. You were born, in that environment. So I think part of decolonizing really is that awareness, that we all exist within that. And so when we approach the study of God, who He is and His character, we are bringing our context as well. We're bringing our socialization as well. And so it will be very wrong, right, for me to say my socialization, as I'm bringing it to the study of God, should be normalized, right? It should be made standard for, for everyone. And so that means, everyone's context and social location as they bring themselves to the study of God is important, and it needs to be considered. And so for Africans, I think there needs to be a freedom to feel like we need to figure out what it means to follow God and love God in our own context. What it means to follow God with the cultural challenges that we face. And if theology for us is actually the true theology, then it needs to answer those things.
It has to, yeah.
It needs to answer the problems and the questions of our context. And so I think for me, the first step is realizing that, and just having that awareness that we are all bringing that context. And I think from an African point of view, there needs to be that freedom to say, theology needs to speak into my context. And there's freedom, there's freedom to do that.
That's good. And I think as you do that, what I've often seen is that we try to say, or we try to construct a certain theology, and then we critique these African authors who are doing these things on the basis of the worldview that we've already built on from the West. So I mean, going back to the issue that's happening in seminary, unfortunately, affects and influence how we then see even our own authors. The standard that we hold them in is not necessarily what's written in the Bible, but it's how well you articulate your point on the basis of a theologian who comes from America or Europe. So I'm saying I think representation is very important for us going on forward. So how do we deconstruct this? I mean, Africa is I think we should go back to those roots of being communal and just really saying, I mean, there's so much richness in the diversity that we have, and I can't come in and say the way I see this verse only says what I think, without actually allowing my other brothers and sisters in the faith from different contexts, from different multi-ethnic groups to speak into it. And that makes us much richer. That makes us much richer. Then we create these theologies that are much more meaningful to our context. But I think the reason why perhaps we haven't been the best at dealing with the issues of our context is because we spend so much time trying to normalize things that went from our context. I mean, to be honest, with all fairness, I mean, the Protestant Reformation, for example, if I was to use them as an example, when, yes, they borrowed from our African fathers, but they did a good job at creating a new worldview. So what we and in so doing, that worldview, unfortunately, us taking it in now, we've normalized it, and we've never said, no, they did well for their context. Let us be faithful in doing well in our context. And every time we have to do it, sort of like a back and forth. So I think representation has to be important. We have to be intentional on that. And also the stories needs to come from different points.
Yeah, and I think that speaks into our scholarship as well. I think it's very important that as Africans, we actually read, people from our context, who are the authors and the pastors and the theologians in our context that are grappling with the things that we are grappling with. It's like John Calvin is not going to talk about land reformation and economic liberation. He's not going to talk about that because he wasn't grappling with those things. Now, there's nothing wrong with John Calvin, but we need more as Africans, because we deal with some of these issues. And so, in terms of scholarship, then I need to read people. I need to read people from our context. And they give in seminary, our curriculums. Need to embrace scholarships that are actually from different contexts. With people, grappling with their different, cultural. Cultural challenges, and so I think it's very critical.
They have to. I think. Absolutely. I do think we have to be intentional. From even teaching the next generation, in representation, we have to be diverse in our scholarship. I don't think we have to really negotiate it, because I don't hold monopoly on truth, and I think it would be unfair for me to then say the way I say things need to be authoritative about what God is saying here. But like I said, we need to be intentional in even our seminaries or scholarship to not read the people who look like it the whole time. And I think it's interesting because when I was looking at the black people in Africa and South Africa, they have a lot of scholarship from white theologians. But when I look at my brothers and sisters who are white, I really find that the same diversity. It's usually they're usually reading people who look like them, and that obviously puts it at a disadvantage, because the way you understand truth is from people who look like you. Then when you do come in a context in which is diverse, you fail to recognize the richness of the people around you. Guys, let us know what you guys think about this, and let us know what you should be grappling about. Hopefully this is becoming important for you guys in your church and wherever setting that you guys are in, and that you become faithful African theologians who will then educate the next generation how to be faithful in God's word, and remembering that God loves Africa as much as He loves the rest of the world. So tune in next time, guys. Have a good one. See you on the other side. Cheers.